Hello, Cecil County and the world. It's May 8th, and I'm Rob Chirnside. And now, Cecil County and the world, we're going to bring you another installment of Cecil Around the World. Picking up where we left off last week, continuing Cecil TV coverage of the vacation of a lifetime, which I took with my lovely young talented bride, Princess Dr. Anastasia Chirnside. Booyah, welcome to the show. This is what I've been doing for the last 6 years on Monday night.
Glad to be here.
Yes, I'm glad you're here too. We're going to talk about our vacation to Indonesia and Singapore tonight, specifically Singapore. Finally, we're back to the farm, back to work, back to Cecil TV. I learned a lot over there, and I know that we learned a lot about the places we visited, such as Singapore, population 6 million, gained independence from Britain in 1963 and became independent from Malaysia, where they joined up with it for a couple of years in 1965. It's now a model urban city.
It's very modern, very clean, with a lot of rules, which we learned how to break while we were there.
I almost got arrested.
And a lot of high rises, a lot of people in this small little island living and adjusting well.
And spending lots of money.
And spending lots of money. Singapore is a bit expensive, but it's well worth the time and effort to go.
And we went there at the behest of my sister, Laura, who's a phys ed teacher at the Singapore American School. And as 1 year before retirement, we figured since
I retired in January, I had time to take a long vacation and get her to show us where she's been living for the last 40-some years. Both in Singapore and in Jakarta in Indonesia.
And we took a lot of pictures.
And she had every day planned where we had to beg for some downtime. But we had a wonderful time. So we arrived in Singapore, and first thing we did was get settled in, took a nap after our 18-hour flight. Long flight to get there. And then we took a walk right from her apartment to an old quarry, which is now a nature preserve. And we were able to walk and see the beautiful scenery and some of the wildlife, which we didn't really see a whole lot compared to, I must say, the top of the Chesapeake Bay. But we did encounter the monkeys, but there was no incidents.
There was nothing going on with the monkeys.
At the quarry preserve. We'll talk about that monkey incident when we talk about Indonesia later on.
She didn't have a car. She took a taxi or the subway, and the subways were really amazing.
Yes, it's very expensive to have a car in Singapore. You have to pay $10,000 up front just to be able to have a car. That's not buying the car or paying for the gas or anything like that. And then cars are only allowed to be 10 years old. So once your car reaches 10 years old, you have to buy another car. So they only keep good running, newer car models on the road. Very organized city, rules for everything. And one of the many rules that we broke without knowing is no eating on the subway. The subway is the cleanest, freshest, air quality wise subway I've ever been on, and very organized. So the first thing in Singapore is we had to learn how to read the subway maps and make our right connections. And so the first day, Laura was still teaching at school, and the following week was her spring break is when we went to Indonesia. So we went down and we took the subway to the Botanical Gardens. And Rob, of course, first thing he did was sit down and open up a bag of snacks.
I was hungry.
He opened the bag and food fell on the floor of the subway. And I look up and I see an older gentleman, one of the few. Everyone else, if you're under a certain age, were glued to your phone on the subway. He was looking at us, shaking his head, going, no, 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 no.
And then he pointed
to the $500 fine for eating on the subway. So I made Rob put his snacks away. But we made it to the Botanical Gardens, and they were beautiful. And we did a lot of walking, saw the orchid garden, where a lot of the famous orchids are dedicated to certain famous people, sometimes people who donated to the gardens. Had a couple incidents with not eating the berries.
That's right. I was hungry. I didn't get much to eat on the subway, you know. So yeah, and we had a great time there. Saw a lot of tropical plants and ended up meeting up with my sister after school in downtown Singapore.
And so we have a lot of pictures of downtown Singapore, and she signed us up for the riverboat tour, which is actually really nice because it happens in the evening when all the lights are on in the city, and you can see from our photos. But it tells you the whole history of Singapore and how they gained their independence, and then they finally broke away from Malaysia. And we got to see some of the famous sites, and we actually got to go to some of the famous sites, like the Fullerton Hotel, where the famous Singapore sling was invented. And the reason the Singapore sling was invented was because at that time, women weren't really allowed to sit in the bars and drink openly. So they came up with a fruity fluff drink so that it would look like that the women were sitting at the bar drinking a fruit punch.
Yeah.
But really they were enjoying their Singapore sling.
We had to sample it naturally.
Yes, so of course we had to go to the Fullerton, eat the peanuts, which were the smallest peanuts I've ever seen compared to American peanuts. They look more like a round soybean for you farmers, but they were quite tasty. One of the last things we did in Singapore was I teach a class at the University of Delaware called Land and Water Management, and I had a whole segment on water reuse and recycling water. And the Gardens by the Bay is this beautiful gardens built on a created island in Singapore from dredging material, and they recycle and reuse all the water from that garden. So I talked about it in my class, and I always said it was on my bucket list. So I got to cross off something on my bucket list in my retirement. So I was really happy about that.
It was pretty cool because you could climb up on this elevated walkway and look at the entire panorama of Singapore, the harbor, and all that. And of course, I think it was after that we went to get Singapore sling, right?
Yeah, we did the gardens.
A yard of beer. I didn't want any one of those.
We have a photo of Rob with his yard of beer. But at least we can say we did that. We were there. We went to the Fullerton and had a Singapore sling. So that was fun.
The Museum of Asian History featured a lot of the history of the entire Southeast Asian area and the influence of the Chinese and the Dutch and what else?
The Javanese and
English,
Balinese,
Balinese, yeah.
dance. And we'll have some pictures of the Hindu gods that they worship or and portray in a lot of their plays that the gamelan plays along with.
Gamelan, what's that?
And they have the gamelan is an all percussion orchestra where they bang on sort of like vibe type instruments or drums and makes all these different sounds. And so usually the Balinese or Javanese plays where they tell stories about the good gods and the evil gods and how they fight one another to save the prince or princess.
Like folklore.
Yes, folklore. And so there's fascinating costumes and traditions that go along with the plays and the dances.
We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in Singapore. Hopefully we'll get back with you again and talk to you about Indonesia, and because there's gazillions of islands there, and it's a melting pot of all the different cultures, including the Dutch and the English and the European and people from all over the world. But that's for another time, another story. Anything else you want to add?
Just join us for the next segment when we hop over to Indonesia.
And don't forget, Cecil County in the world. Coming up this week, May 8th through 13th, is the Water Witch Carnival on Port Deposit Tome Highway. Helps the first responders, help the first responders because they're there to help you. Next week, or actually next weekend, the 19th and the 20th, the Scottish Games will be in downtown Elkton on the Friday with Charlie Zahn performing, and on the 20th with just the whole Scottish Games deal at Fair Hill. And in honor of our first responders, Stacey and I are going to sing a song that was inspired by our son who at the age of 3 brought a pack of matches to me and said, I must have dropped them somewhere. Matches are dangerous. Shall we get with it?
Sure.